It's always an honor and a pleasure to be at Malaprops, and I feel so lucky that we can gather from actually two continents this session. It's an amazing little silver lining we have here. And it is particularly my honor to introduce the two people who will be speaking with you today. We're here to celebrate a very special book, and this book comes from a very special press. So before we talk about the book and these wonderful speakers, I just want to say a few words about the University of North Carolina Press. One reason it's a special time for us at the press, and of which I'm part of the Advancement Council and a representative for the western part of the state, is that the UNC Press has just turned 100 years old. And it was founded in 1922. It is part of an amazing history in the state of North Carolina of independent, highly juried, critical thinking publishing. And we need that more than ever right now. We are very proud of the wide range of books the press publishes, including this marvelous one you're going to hear about in a few minutes. And one thing I didn't know before I started working some with the press is that the press publishes 125 books a year. That's one new book every 3 days. And these are books that range over a huge range of topics. Some are academic books, some are more mainstream general interest books, and they have always had a really strong line of history of the US, history of North Carolina, history of the peoples of the American South, and sociology as well. And today we have many of those things mixed in with art history. So I'm very excited. I want to introduce, first of all, our author today. And usually when I do these programs with and for authors, I have a little process where I go through, I take their bios, and with the speakers too, and I kind of trim down. What can we lose here so we can do this more efficiently? But today I'm going to promise you to not be efficient, because the bios of the two speakers you're about to hear are so extraordinary. And they have such amazing kind of overlap and echoes with each other that I actually want to walk through them with you. So I'm not talking about 700 pages a piece, I promise, but I do just want you to know the remarkable accomplishments of these two speakers. So our author today, Glenda Elizabeth Gilmore, and we're here to celebrate this book, which has just come out, and you'll hear a lot about it from her and from our other speaker, interviewer. Gilmore is the Peter B. and C. Vann Woodward Professor of History Emerita at Yale University, where she was also a member of the African American Studies and American Studies departments. A North Carolina native, she earned her PhD at UNC Chapel Hill, and her previous prize-winning books include Gender and Jim Crow, Women and the Politics of White Supremacy in North Carolina, 1898 to 1920, and Defying Dixie, The Radical Roots of Civil Rights, 1920 to 1950. She also co-authored the book, These United States, The Making of a Nation, 1890 to the present. And she is recipient of many fellowships, a National Endowment for the Humanities, a Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship, a Radcliffe Institute Fellowship, National Humanities Center, American Council of Learned Societies, and the National Gallery of Art. She is an elected fellow of the Society of American Historians and a former president of the Southern Association for Women Historians and president, very recently actually, of this, and still, right, at the moment, of the Southern Historical Association. She's appeared in and served as consultant to several historical documentaries, which I'm now very eager to see, including the Emmy Award-winning The African Americans, Many Rivers to Cross. So aren't you glad I didn't skip any of that? I had an equally strong reaction to the wonderful scholar who is going to be in conversation today with Gilmore, Adriane Lentz-Smith. Welcome. Lynn-Smith is Associate Professor of History and African American Studies at Duke University, where she teaches courses on Black lives, modern America, and history and fact and fiction. Another one I think we'd all like to take. A scholar of African American history, as well as the US and the world, Lentz-Smith is author of Freedom Struggles, African Americans and World War I from Harvard University Press. And her articles, The Laws Have Hurt Me, Violence, Violation, and Black Women's Struggles for Civil Rights, can be found in the fall 2020 issue of Southern Cultures. Her current book, The Slow Death of Sagon, Penn, State Violence and the Twilight of Civil Rights, explores the long aftermath of one man's devastating encounters with the police in San Diego in 1985. She is a senior fellow in Duke's Kenan Institute for Ethics and hosts the Kenan's community series, The Ethics of Now. She also is involved in documentaries. She can be seen in the PBS documentaries, The Great War, American Diplomat, and Voice of Freedom. She holds a BA in history from Harvard-Radcliffe and a PhD in history from Yale University. She lives in Durham, North Carolina with her family. So if you were paying attention for that long and worthwhile reading, you have noted already that these biographies together cover scholarship of, I'm looking at, I'd say 300 to 400 years of history, let's call it 450, given the history of the United States and the colonies, and some really strong and wonderful North Carolina connections. So please welcome me and help me welcome myself, these two remarkable speakers, Professor Gilmore and Professor Lentz-Smith. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
We're delighted. Thank you.
And hi, Glenda.
Hi, Adriane. How are you?
I'm doing all right.
Good. It's good to be here.
I am very excited to talk to you about this book. And what I thought I would do as an opening is to ask you a very general question, which is just, how did you come to be interested in Romare Bearden? Well, Romare, is that right? Am I saying?
You know, it's really ambiguous. We could just clear the air about that to start with. His name has a Swedish origin. In Swedish, it would be Romare. It's not French, so it really wouldn't be Romare, but most people do call him Romare. His family called him Romy. So why don't we just call him Romy? I think that's easier.
I'm from the deep South, Glenda. I'm going to call him Romare.
Okay. Romare.
How did you come to get interested in Mr. Bearden?
When I was living in Charlotte for from 73 to 94. And in that time, Charlotteans discovered Romare Bearden, and there was a major exhibition in 1970, but he basically became a household word. People were collecting him, people were collecting prints. When I wrote my first book, Gender and Jim Crow, I began to notice in the newspaper, the Charlotte paper had a full page of Black news in the 1890s. I began to, and the Star of Zion newspaper, the AME Zion newspaper, they talked about his great-grandfather and his great-grandmother, Henry Kennedy and Rosa Catherine Gosprey Kennedy, and his grandmother, Caddy Bearden. So I began to see the Bearden name in the archives in Charlotte. And his great-grandmother and grandmother were presidents of the Women's Christian Temperance Union in Charlotte. And then later, Caddy was vice president of the state WCTU. So I was interested in him. Then there was the great exhibition at the National Gallery in the early 2000s that Ruth Fine curated. And that just reinforced my interest when I wrote my second book, Defying Dixie. His mother, Bessie Bearden, was all over the news. She's a politician. She's the Harlem correspondent for the Chicago newspaper, and is really one of the most prominent women in the United States at the time. So all of those hints made me think that I'd be interested in writing a biography of 4 generations of his family, not just one.
So I'm going to follow this up with the classic historian's question about change and continuity, right? That in some ways, you could read this book in its form and its method as being a departure from your earlier works. There are other ways in which you could read it as being, I mean, exactly in the sort of narrative that you just gave, right? You were in the archive, you found some people, and eventually they got their own book. But will you reflect a little bit on how this book is and isn't like previous work that you've done, and what the influence of African-American studies, how visible the influence of African-American studies is on this one in particular?
I'd love to. Ralph Ellison said, art is the mystery that gets left out of history. And I thought it would be a tremendous shame if I wrote the book and wasn't able to access the mystery in history. Historians generally go to the archives, get the story, line it up, and tell it. But I wanted to write really about, excuse me, Bearden's, not just the facts, but also what Bearden thought to be true about his family, and how his partial memories and how his imagination influenced his art. So in the end, I think the book is a biography of 4 generations. It's a biography of Bearden. It's a biography of his artistic practice, but it's also a kind of meditation on imagination. And as a historian, we're taught not to do that. In about 2005 or so, I began to migrate to African American studies at Yale, where I was appointed. And it really opened my eyes and completely changed this book because it's interdisciplinary. I worked and shared work in seminars with art historians, Coben and Mercer, Elizabeth Alexander, a poet, Daphne Brooks, who writes about music, Hazel Carby, who writes about literature. And they kind of freed me up as a historian. They don't call it a discipline for nothing. I was disciplined by history to make an argument. So I've written a book in which the art becomes the archive, and in which a lot of what I might think about that art, what might be in that art, is speculative, which is also a departure for historians. I try to let the mystery hang in the air in the book.
I mean, I think that there are a lot of, and I guess it comes out of the similar, so my graduate students right now are really interested in Saidiya Hartman and the idea of critical sort of fabulation. And there's a way that they're doing it through language. They're trying to figure out how to tell, like open up and ponder spaces through words. But what you're doing is thinking about how Bearden got to this process earlier and in a different form.
That's so apt. Yeah, that's a really good analogy.
I was going to ask you a question about exile and return and thinking about how those ideas have carried across your book. But something that you said made me want to go actually to the second piece of art that we had thought about discussing, which is The Sunset and Moonrise with Maudel Sleet. So I'm going to share the screen right now. And I'm going to ask you to say a little bit more about Bearden and his sense of memory, right? So straight memory, kind of like the relationship between memory, imagination, self-making, that sort of thing.
You know, I love this. This is sunset and moonrise, that time in the evening when you can catch lightning bugs and still see them when it cools down a little bit. Many people have thought about Bearden's work as autobiographical. And it's more an autobiography of his imagination. There are autobiographical bits in it. He was 5 years old when he left Charlotte in kind of a tragic way. And he had lived with his great-grandparents, his grandmother, his parents in a family complex. So he was extremely middle class, very prominent family. His work is autobiographical in that it's sparked by little pieces of memory and collage and augmented with artistic practice. For example, in this painting, there's a cabin there, but there's also a mountain that looks like Mont Saint-Victoire, which Cézanne was his favorite artist, so that's there. He is probably painting, he had a vague memory. You know how when before you're 5 years old, you can't really make sense of things and you can't really make sense of your memories later. So he has snatches of things. He remembered a woman who grew vegetables. I searched for her for years. There is no Maudel Sleet ever in the census anywhere, but there is a neighbor named Maud Slade who grew up on a farm, married, and moved into the neighborhood. And I think that it was her garden that inspired him. Maudel Sleet here is sort of the meta history of African-American women, moved rural to urban within the South. She later moves to Washington, D.C. People brought their rural practices with them. Here she's in the garden, she's hoeing. Her hands are enormous. In Bearden's work, hands really matter. And it shows in this that she's capable of doing a man's job. She's got already this magic that's come out of the ground. She's got tomatoes, little sweet cucumbers, she's standing cabbage with collard greens behind her. She's a magician to him. And working through this, thinking about the South in this way, he ultimately, the last painting he paints of Maudel Sleet, doesn't even have Maudel Sleet in it. It just has the vegetables. And his oral biographer asked him, "Oh, Maudel Sleet wasn't even the painting." And Bearden says, "That was Maudel Sleet." And to him, it was. He says, "I never left Charlotte except physically." Yet he was 5 years old when he left.
Yeah. I mean, so place plays a huge role across all of your books. And yet in each of them, and maybe this is just because it's true for every person, in each of them, place is something different. So when Bearden says that he never left Charlotte except in his imagination, what does that mean? And how is he different from, say, the Southerners in Defying Dixie who've left because they've kind of been run out? And you talk about them as refugees or exiles. Or George White in your first book, who is only there for a second, but, you know, the last congressman, like when Jim Crow becomes law in North Carolina, who leaves.
That's right. The last black congressman before Mel Lott. Leaves in 1902, I think. So I think Bearden once got a little miffed when the Mint Museum did a huge exhibition of his work, and that in 1970, and called him an expatriate. And he said, I never left Charlotte except physically. I'm not an expatriate. I think leaving North Carolina myself and going to New Haven, my family on both sides are 8th generation North Carolinians. So that's kind of an unusual thing in my family. Place, I believe, helps the historian. It's a tool for the historian in the beginning to understand the place, to understand. It means that you understand context. It means that you can reconstitute how things looked. That's important enough. And it also gives you the political surround, the social surround, and in Defying Dixie, that was important. But I think what the tragedy of the Great Migration was, these people took home in their hearts. They carried home with them when they went to the North. And while it's often cast as opportunity, they went north for opportunity, they are refugees. It is in many, many ways a tragedy. Place, sensually, we don't get to write about that as historians, but I did in this book. It evokes smells, it evokes visual flashbacks. You can even feel in your body the sense of a place. And I think Bearden felt that and carried it with him as he went along. I don't think there's any history without place.
Yeah. And I mean, and you could extend that given his response to the Mint Museum, that on some level there's not, I mean, his response would suggest that he felt that there's not self without some assertion of place, right? Or some assertion of location.
Well, I mean, that's a very Southern thing for both Black and white people.
Yeah.
Where are you from is we talk about placing people, literally placing people. And place can only tell you so much. Getting out of place can tell you something.
Right.
But and I don't want to say that the Beardens suffered because they left. They had many opportunities because they left that they couldn't have accomplished in Charlotte. But he carried those early memories of sight, smell, taste from home.
Another way to think about it or talk about it, and I'm making a transition because I also want to talk about the collage, watching the good trains go by, but that there's a lot in Bearden's story too about how the world acts on you or you're in it, no matter what you imagine your place is. So can you talk about Bearden as a traveler, I'm stumbling because I was about to say cosmopolitan. I don't know if that's overstating it, but can you talk about Bearden in the world?
And he's very much in the world. He spends the year that he's 9 and 10 in Pittsburgh, where he's left with his grandparents. Before that, they had lived in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, which never appears in his memory. He never mentions it. But I think he was 7, 8, turning 9. There's Charlotte, there's Harlem, which is probably the most cosmopolitan place in the United States at the time he lived there. He's a bridge between the Harlem Renaissance and the Black Arts movement. That's a life. That's an incredible time to be alive. He lived in Paris for a few months, and then he and his wife, Nanette Rohan Bearden, built a house in her ancestral home of St. Martin, and they spent 4 months there every year. He said that each of those places changed his artistic practice, and you can see it when he begins to travel south, 1940, etc., but especially when he gets to stay in St. Martin, color becomes so much more vivid in his work. And it's a statement in and of itself. It structures the work. And so he takes pieces of all of this, all of his experience. He tours South America and brings it into his art, which just enriches his imagination. And so it's autobiography, but not autobiography at the same time. He also traveled. He was a 19th century man, Adriane. He lived in the 19th century because he lived with his great-grandparents and his grandmother. So he's a time traveler too.
So I'm going to share this collage, which I have always read as being about the Great Migration. And I'm interested in having you either affirm, but probably not, but also just kind of like layer my understanding of what he's up to here.
Okay, I love this. You have to know first that this would have been the view from his great-grandparents' home at 401 Graham Street in Charlotte. The main Southern Railway train tracks run right in front of the house at a distance. The building on the left is Magnolia Cotton Mill, and they lived in a Victorian 2-story house, which is in the upper right. It speaks to what we were talking about with model sleep, because there's a rooster. I'm not sure you can see it, but it's in the lower right above the flowers. So, country come to town. I like to think, so Bearden invites you to make up your own stories. There isn't any right or wrong about this. Yes, it's about the Great Migration, but his father was also a railway conductor. He feels trains in his body. He went to sleep for 5 years listening to the big trains come by. The woman in the dotted apron, I fancy that she's someone from South Carolina, and green skirt. I fancy that she's someone from South Carolina who's done the rural to urban migration. She won't be moving again. Folk musicians, the man in the middle, would have traveled by train all over the South, and, any places like the next place, maybe. The guy in the white hat looks pretty resolute that he's staying put. I don't know. Everybody didn't leave. The woman in between them, the folk musician and white hat man, she's pensive about it, and she's barefooted. So there she is. Is she going north? But my favorite figure in this, and I would love to hear what you think, is the man in the tan uniform or jumpsuit right under the train.
His back is to us.
Yes. He's already made up his mind. He's leaving. But I wonder if you think, having written on World War I, that he's a World War I vet, or that uniform is supposed to suggest that.
I would imagine so. And then, and so is he leaving? Is he returning home from war? Is he, it also kind of around it looks almost fiery, right?
True.
It's kind of like orange. And so he's walking out of one conflagration, and we know that World War I was followed by a summer of racial violence like nothing we've ever seen, or had not up until that point, that then would drive more people both to leave, but also to realize that these places that they were going to as havens were no havens at all, right? So
right.
What is he walking into or from?
That's right. He's hunched over, moving, leaving, and I don't think he knows. Bearden invited you to tell that story.
Bearden and Gilmore together. We've talked a fair bit. Hi, Model Sleep. We've talked a fair bit about Bearden and his in memory, right? Sort of producing out of memory. But one of the things that was really interesting to me that I hadn't realized until I read your book is that, like, Bearden had an artistic life. It occurred many places. It occurred over decades. Bearden had a day-to-day, like, go to work life that was never on pause in a way that the artistic life actually did have a couple of pauses. And that work actually seems really important and meaningful. If that's all that he had ever done, he still would have been someone who'd done something. And
right. And I think so too. I think you're right about that. So let me just do a little background. Bearden had 2 years in fine arts at BU. He'd been painting and cartooning for the Crisis, etc. In the 1930s, he studied with George Gross at the Art Students League. So he was always an artist, but he couldn't support himself as an artist. And Black artists, the art world was segregated. He couldn't show at most galleries. So he took a job through his mother's influence, probably, although he did have a BA from NYU in education, as a social worker. And he worked with immigrants from the South in the beginning. I think that is really telling, because he went into their homes every day, saw their stuff, saw their possessions, saw who they were. Later, after the 30s, he worked for 30 years as a social worker. He began to work with Roma people, with gypsies. And so that changed because there weren't the rural to urban migrants from the South. But he also made art every day. He went to his studio at 4:00 and worked every single day. When he traveled, he did watercolors because they're easy to transport. So he never complained about his day job. He did stop in his 50s or early 60s when he won a Guggenheim and his art began to sell in the late 1950s, early 1960s. So I think that he understood it was valuable, and it certainly was.
so, I mean, the interesting thing about biography, as you know, as you taught me on some level, is that it disrupts our easy periodizations or characterizations, right? So he's not artist or social worker, he is both, and he is pulling from all of those things to make this sort of composite. He's not operating in memory or the present, he is fusing those and producing something. Is there a way to, like, I keep asking you questions, I'm a historian and I think of you as a historian, I keep asking you like questions about the history of it all, but does his life, his biography, actually also help us think about different artistic moments and movements as well? You mentioned that, you know, in some ways he bridges the Harlem Renaissance to the Black arts movement. But does he see himself as, like, does he have
Yes.
thoughts about where he is in time, I guess?
He does. And in the beginning, he writes an essay that's sort of explosive in Opportunity magazine about the Black artist, saying that Black artists shouldn't be confined to traditional landscape painting, etc., to prove that they're good artists, that they should be able to do modernism. He thinks he's going to be a cartoonist, but then he studies at the Art Students League with George Gross, who teaches him that art is also drawing, that drawing and art are the same thing. And he studies old masters. He turns to social realism painting, squash, which is a heavy kind of watercolor, in the 1930s, and has some success, does a couple of shows. He was influenced by Diego Rivera, who was a friend of his mother's, who was in New York. And then in the 1940s, he turns to abstract art, which his abstract art draws a lot on the same defined lines, open spaces, cubist sensibility that he has all the way through his life. And so you can see how that ultimately comes together in collage. Those techniques. He has a lot of success as an abstract artist in the 1940s and is represented by Samuel Coutts, who represents Picasso, is Picasso's American agent as well. But it breaks his heart because abstract expressionism moves to intrasubjective expression and abstraction, which means that you don't represent anything. You don't have representations of actual things, people, places. That was a bridge too far for Bearden.
Right. And Coates was Coates a white Southerner? Was that Coates?
He's from Norfolk, and he owned modern art beginning in the 1940s. And he was Motherwell's representative. Every famous early 50s abstract artist was represented by Coates. He represented Bearden from about 45, 46 to 48, 47.
And you mentioned, I'm going to share this 1945 watercolor, You Are Dead Forever. You mentioned that he was in abstract. I mean, I found this interesting because I just had no idea that this period in Bearden's art existed. But also you mentioned that he was representing something. This was before you didn't have a subject.
He called it semi-abstraction. And this is from the Coates show about a series of paintings on the crucifixion of Christ, none of which actually have this figure in the middle. This is called You Are Dead Forever. His mother had just died, and he often represents his mother wearing a red dress and a cloche hat, looking sort of like this. She's lurking in some of the other crucifixion paintings, but I think this is his mother. This person has breast. I'm assuming it's not Jesus, and you wouldn't say to Jesus, you are dead forever.
Unless you're starting a new religion.
Yes. And so I think that he slips in Bessie Bearden into this. She died very young, very tragically, in hospital. So I think he slips into this, a personal statement, and even makes the crucifixion autobiographical, but not literally in those ways.
Again, I kept thinking when I was thinking about how his storytelling and how we were to engage it, when I was reading your book about a quote that many a historian has borrowed from Barbara Fields about you take your historical subjects seriously, but not literally. And there's a way that Bearden offers a means to do that, that opens up like paths for doing it in all other kinds of places. I think, we're going to turn to question and answer in just a second, but I want to ask you one other question before everybody else has an opportunity to chime in. And that is, as you said, this is a biography of 4 generations. Family is foundational to this book. And so I was wondering how you were thinking about love and loss since writing this book. And then also, because there's a lot of conversations kind of here on the Duke campus about reparations and what those mean. I also wondered if you had thought about Black wealth as a material thing through the Kennedys and Beardens, but also as a more ephemeral and abstracted thing.
So Bearden's family's incredibly successful. His great-grandfather's literate on emancipation. He's a federal railway clerk. They own a family complex, 3 houses, a grocery store. They take in boarders. They rent the houses. They own the houses mortgage-free. Neighborhood is integrated. Property values are high. The neighborhood is segregated. Property values go down. And then there's the horrible disfranchised campaign in North Carolina at the turn of the 20th century. So by the time that Henry Kennedy dies, he's listed as a laborer in the census in 1932. Every generation of Bearden's family faces loss, tangible loss, not just of memory of loved ones, but of property, of place. And they rebuild themselves in the next generation. So seeing Bearden represented as some half, that he was a primitive artist who grew up in his grandmother's cabin, just perpetuates the idea that African Americans have had a linear rise in American history, culminating in the subject at hand, be it Bearden or whoever else, when in fact it's been a story of theft and loss, and structurally, literally, over time, for from Reconstruction to the end of the late into the 20th century. This family, though, loved each other, and they carried with them the memory of that love, and they knew who they were.
Right. What did that mean for Bearden operationally? What was his relationship with his family? What were his other relationships like? How did he go about in the world with people?
And he was devoted to his great-grandfather. He was devoted to his grandmother. But then after they moved to North, they didn't go back except one time, I think, because it's a complicated story. But he adored his great-grandfather. He adored his mother. And she adored him. His mama loved him, and he loved his daddy, who was a hopeless alcoholic, but a sweet one. So that, his father was very much within the family. He didn't marry. He lived with his mother until she died while he was in service in World War II. And then he lived with his dad until he did marry in the early 1950s, in his late 40s, early 40s. And lived with his father, even though his father was pretty much descended into alcoholism. Also, he had friends. He loved his friends. His friends loved him. Reading his correspondence is just like a hug.
Yeah. And then sure, and friends who, there's a way in which his social world gives you this window into kind of mid 20th century Black life. So you can also read the book just for a richer sense of,
if I didn't mention Albert Murray at this moment, I would be really missing the opportunity. Albert Murray just devoted himself to Bearden, watched him paint. They inspired each other. They were each other's muse.
And for readers who might not know who watchers, wherever we're in, who Albert Murray was?
He was a writer. He wrote South to a Very Old Place. He's a fabulous writer. At South to a Very Old Place, I say in the book, reads like James Joyce got on the Southern Crescent and went to New Orleans. He's a wonderful writer who taught at Tuskegee for many years because he couldn't support himself with his writing and live in Harlem, and then eventually did move to Harlem.
So you started thinking about this book 2 decades ago. By the time there's the way that you think about your subject or what you think you've learned when you finished a book. And then what you feel that or what you feel that the big takeaways are months after you finish the book, or now when you're sort of talking to the world about it. But so what is how did what you knew about Bearden change from when you started the book to when you finished? And what do you want people to take away from it now?
So it's sort of personal, and it's sort of about Bearden. As I wrote other books in between that are traditional history books, arguments. You could have outlined those books. This book you can't outline. I couldn't foresee what I would be saying or which piece of art I would use. The art tells part of the story. Bearden awoke for me my memory. He says he wishes he could turn the calendar back and go back to that old July. I was raised by 19th century people too. And he awoke for me all of those sensual memories of the South, all of the smells and the taste that he carried with him, and the visions. I just had to wait 18 years or so to be able to find a way to talk about that and to let myself talk about that. As a historian, we don't talk a lot about things that are more sensory. We don't talk a lot about imagination. I would hope that people take away from the book that Bearden's connected to the world. He's a universal humanist. He uses his imagination like a muscle. He's able to imagine other people, other places, and yet stay grounded in who he is. And to me, that's a goal worth striving for.
Yeah. I feel like as historians, we're really interested in memory, and there's been a lot of writing about history and memory, but we're also very wary of it. You know, the kind of idea that, like, who can actually remember what happened yesterday?
And
right?
we try to classify it. We try to put it in, here's how memory works. We don't know how memory works. We know how history makes memory work, but memory, and when you get older, you realize you know nothing about how memory works because you remember things that are useless and some that are useful, but very fewer of those. So it's a matter of dealing with things that are beyond the realm of the concrete and the objective, dealing with the subjective. And I would love to hear historians do that more and to open themselves to doubt, because there's a lot of doubt in this book. I'm not sure at many turns, but it's well worth the uncertainty. It's well worth the mystery.
Yeah. And you say that you asked me to read a piece of that collage with the idea that there are no wrong answers, that my interpretation has some sort of validity and meaning. But I do have questions about production and consumption, right? Is there a meaning that someone might put on one of Bearden's work about Charlotte, about Black life, about Southernness, that could do violence to his intent or could be a corruption? Like, do you think that one can go too far? Or do you think that one can co-opt? Is there a point where you're co-opting somebody else's
meaning
into your own narrative?
Sure. On the other hand,
I mean, part of me wants you to just leave it at that. Yes, Adriane, that's for you to work out.
On the other hand, Adriane, that's for you to work out. I'll see you next week on that.
Yeah.
No, I do think Liza in High Cotton is an example. People take that literally, that he worked in a cotton field with this woman named Liza.
Right.
They take literally. They then move forward with all Black people in the South picked cotton, and then things go wrong.
I was going to try to find Liza in High Cotton in the book, but I'm not that fast. The book, dear viewer, which you might remember, is called Romare Bearden, in the Homeland of His Imagination. I also am holding it out because it is a gorgeous, gorgeous book, and I am still shallow enough to judge a book by its cover.
And that's thanks to UNC Press. They did a beautiful job with the book.
Yeah, and we opened with an appreciation of UNC Press, and I think it's probably appropriate here in a North Carolina bookstore in this moment when folks are critical of knowing things about Black people and knowing things about art and just knowing things, to appreciate the work that the press has given and supported and allowed scholars to circulate. So yay.
Yay, UNC Press. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and what a good combo. Glenda Gilmore and the University of North Carolina Press. I think that we are coming to the end of our time and should turn the camera back over, turn the floor back over. But I wanted to thank you for this conversation and this time and this book, and for the scholar and person that you are. I really have enjoyed this.
Adriane, thank you for everything, especially this now, but everything.
I would just like to add my thanks to the both of you. Adriane, I'll just ditto to everything you just said to Glenda Gilmore, and Glenda Gilmore, thank you so much. Thank you both so much. Adriane, marvelous questions. This has been just a wonderful conversation. And I think reflects the book in that it's been, ostensibly about a person, but it's been so wide ranging and touching on so many things and so many important things. And as you just said, Adriane, especially now, when there's this, what for me is a little bit of inscrutable pushback on, on knowledge and
on not being ignorant.
On not being ignorant and being inclusive in how we learn and how we approach topics. Particularly appreciative of this conversation this afternoon. I'll add my thanks again as well to UNC Press and to Elizabeth Kostova for appearing today to introduce you both. And before we leave, I will just invite the both of you to share any final words you might have as well before we say thank you again to our audience and let everyone get back to their day.
Sure, I'll go first because I imagine that Glenda as author should have the last word. I'll just say that, over the past couple of years, I'm writing a book about a really awful thing and have needed reminders of beauty and joy and how people have produced things, not in denial of the world around them, and not quite in defiance, but to say that they are more than the most awful things that there are out there. And that this Bearden book and Bearden's work was such a lovely model and example for thinking about what art does, not just for like aficionados and appreciators, but for folks who are trying to live well and joyfully. So, yay.
Wow, thank you. I'm going to end on a lighter note and urge all of you North Carolinians who are Panthers fans to root for Maudel Sleet when you're watching the next game, because her garden, I think, as I have found it, is probably under the 50-yard line of that stadium. So I'm hoping that a squash vine will appear and cover the field.
People can root for that,
so
whether
much.
They're Panthers fans or not.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much again. It's been such a pleasure. And we're so glad to hear about this beautiful book, Romare Bearden in the Garden of His Imagination. And thanks again to everyone who's been with us. We appreciate you, and please stay safe and well. We look forward to seeing you again in some form sometime soon.
Great.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.